Jeffrey Kripal is the J. Newton Rayzor Professor of Religion and Chair of Philosophy and Religious Thought at Rice University. He currently helps direct the Center for Theory and Research at the Esalen Institute. Jeffrey has written numerous books, including Authors of the Impossible, The Superhumanities, and How to Think Impossibly, about souls, UFOs, time, belief, and everything else. Scroll into the description for timestamps, extra info, and useful links. And if you enjoy this video, please like, comment, and share. Thank you. Thank you so much for doing this with me, Jeff, and thank you to our mutual friend Ed Kelly for connecting us. To begin, could you please say a few words about your background and about who you are?
Sure. Well, thank you. Thanks for having me, Ben. My name is Jeff Kripal. I'm a historian of religions. I teach the comparative study of religion at Rice University in Houston, Texas. That's a very quick introduction, but that's essentially who I am and what I do.
Yeah. When you have interests in all sorts of areas that this topic explores, like religion, obviously, as previously stated, the UFO phenomenon, parapsychology, anomalous phenomena, these are obviously very big terms that have lots of things underneath them. But how did you kind of develop your interest in these areas in the first place? Was it all kind of as part of one thing, or did they come separately into your life?
Well, that's a long story, but I'll keep it quick. I mean, basically, it was people, Ben. I was writing a history of the human potential movement in the US, in California, actually. It came out in 2007. And in that research, I talked to hundreds and hundreds of people who had one crazy experience after another and told me about them. And I realized, A, they were not deceiving me, and B, they were struggling with these things. These were shocking experiences, things like seeing one's own body during birth, or seeing a UFO, or having some kind of near-death experience or psychedelic experience. And these people were traumatized by these things. They were not trying to persuade me of anything. And I realized that my own field, the study of religion, had taken these off the table and dismissed them, basically, as legends or as power games, essentially, and that this was deeply mistaken. And so about 05, 06, somewhere in there, I started to turn to paranormal phenomena as essentially religious, or as proto-religious. I would say they're proto-religious. And I began really to research how intellectuals in the 19th and early 20th century were fascinated by these things, and how that was dismissed or taken off the table in the 20th century. And so I essentially wrote an intellectual history of the paranormal called Authors of the Impossible, which came out in 2010. And then I wrote a book on science fiction and comics because I began to think that art and authors in particular were tuned into this, and they created art out of their experiences. They didn't try to prove them in the laboratory. And I found that very interesting and very plausible, but also very amenable to my own training, my own methods, which was really in the humanities. It's not in the sciences. And so, I just became the guy that was arguing for this humanist or historical or experiential approach to anomalous phenomena, and not this objective third-person scientific approach, which I don't dismiss, but it's simply not mine, and I don't think it's very effective a lot. I think it's much more effective to look at spontaneous, extreme, impossible experiences, not bored sophomores in a classroom guessing at cards and falling asleep.
Yeah. That last thing you said very much resonates with something Stephen Browdy recently said to me about the focusing on the real life. Events.
Well, Steve knows well. And oh my gosh, I mean, we have his papers in our Archives of the Impossible, which is right here. And I've read Steve for a long time. And I mean, that's essentially one of his he has many arguments, of course, but that's one of his arguments, is that you really need to look at these real world cases. And sometimes they're fraudulent and sometimes they're not. And you need to get into the field and talk to people and be with people and watch the stuff happening as it happens.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I had 2 interviews with him recently. Fascinating guy, and had so many, as you say, experiences, like real life experiences, both genuine seemingly and fraudulent seemingly. But yeah, the full I don't know the word, the full house.
Steve is also what I call a badass intellectual. I mean, he goes after people, and he goes after ideas that aren't so good. And so I just love that. I'm a nicer guy, by the way. I don't I don't tend to go after those ideas or those people, but Steve does, and I love Steve for it. He gets into trouble for it sometimes, but all the more reason, I think, to do it.
Yeah, he is a lovely guy as well. To be fair, I know you don't mean anything to the contrary.
No,
but I know you meant the kind of the cliche of nice guy. But yeah, he is also a lovely guy.
I feel nothing but affection and admiration for Steve Dowdy.
Yeah, I agree. I only recently got connected with him, but like straight away, he's a really, really nice guy, and fascinating work and everything. He sent me some papers and stuff that I'm looking forward to reading. To quote the title of one of your books, The Flip, I wanted to ask, when did you actually undergo your flip, and like what were the contributing factors to that?
Yeah, I get asked that a lot.
Yeah, I bet you
do, and I struggle a bit with it because I think my flip was gradual, and sometimes it's a flop, as I say. I think there was a gradual realization that we talked about earlier, where I realized that these experiences actually do happen.
Yeah.
And I am much more interested in other people's experiences. I have had my own flipped experiences that I do write about, but I don't think they're that interesting, and I don't consider them primary. I really consider the whole range of experiences primary. And I think this is a social kind of community phenomenon. It's not an individual. There's nothing special about me, I'll say that. But I do think there's something special about the human being, and that these things do happen all the time. So it's a long way of saying my flip happened gradually over about 10 years, maybe. And it happened because of those people again, and thinking about them and living with them and working with them and talking to experiencers and taking them seriously and not dismissing their experiences through some kind of reductive code. This is about society, or this is about some need to, fulfill the ego, or this is about power, or whatever it's about. None of that really works in these situations. And so my flip was gradual, is what I'm trying to say. And now, Ben, I'm not even interested in arguing with debunkers. It's not even, to me, the question about whether they're real or not is just silly. Of course they're real. The question is, of course, what is real? And so my simplest definition is that these things happen. What they actually mean or point to, I don't know. But I think that's what intellectuals should be asking. And I think in particular that scholars and historians of religions should be asking those questions, because these experiences are clearly at the base of a lot of religious systems and a lot of religious behavior. And I'm puzzled and a bit dismayed that my colleagues aren't more interested in this.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And about the debunkers, like I think anybody that comes at something from that point of view, from that starting place of I'm going to debunk this, it's kind of already in bad faith, essentially. Like you're not coming at it with an open mind and trying to genuinely, scientifically,
Yeah, and it's not that the critical questions haven't been asked. Of course, they've been asked. They've been asked by the researchers and writers themselves. And of course, we listen to the skeptical community. Sometimes they have a lot to say, and their questions come from a place of legitimacy and concern. So I don't dismiss the skeptical questions, but I do dismiss the debunking effort, which I think is just a worldview or an ideology posing as a skeptical inquiry. I don't think it's skeptical at all. I think it knows darn well what it thinks and what the world's like. And I just think they're wrong. I just think that kind of framework is deeply mistaken. And so, and the other reason I don't engage debunkers is it takes too much time. It takes too much time and space, and I don't have it.
Yeah,
Ben.
it's draining.
I just don't have that space and don't have that time. I don't think we have the time, by the way. I think it's time to move on and to push the ball down the court, or whatever the metaphor is. I don't know whatever metaphor you want, but just I think the point of a lot of debunking is to stop the conversation. And I think we should have the conversation. And so let's have the conversation, forget it, forget them. Let's just go on, that's been my operating mode. And I hope it's not dismissive again of the skeptical questions, but it is dismissive of the ideology.
Yeah. No, again, I completely agree. I think, again, we just spoke about Steve Browday, and he's somebody that, you could easily consider him a skeptic, but a debunker would label him a believer. And all these things are, they're just terms. But true skepticism is questioning, right?
The thing about Steve is, I'm going to go back to Steve. He's really not a believer. I mean, belief is, to me, it's a kind of intellectual assent to someone else's anomalous experiences, usually in the past or the far past. Steve has seen this up close. It is not a matter of belief. It's a matter of of course, so, and then he philosophizes about it. And of course, asks all kinds of skeptical questions of the religious systems, which I share. I mean, I think his questions around the survival question and psychokinesis and everything, I mean, they're all entirely legitimate. And that's what I mean about the questions. These are internal to the conversation. These are not being turned away or rejected. I think they're crucial. And of course, all of these experiences too, they're all historical. They all have historical and cultural conditionings behind them or in them. And this is where a humanist or historian is very good at showing how these are culturally conditioned or historically determined. And I think that's true as well. So it's a kind of both and approach is what I'm trying to say. It's both critical theory, but also a kind of affirmation of the phenomenon.
We just spoke as well about the flip a few minutes ago. Do you see that as like parallel or just another word for a spiritual awakening, or do you, what's the relationship between those two concepts?
So let me talk a bit about that book, The Flip. It came out in, I don't know, 2019. And then it was re-released in 2020, unfortunately, right as the pandemic was happening. So it got smashed by the pandemic, I think. But The Flip originated actually as an article that I wrote for the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is the kind of the New York Times in the US of the higher education world. And it's called Visions of the Impossible. And I basically just set out in that essay what I think about these things, which is A, that they happen, and B, that they should be central to any humanist enterprise, and that C, the scientific community certainly should be interested in them, but that's a different kind of method and enterprise, and probably not as effective as the humanist or historical one. So an editor read that. An editor for a press called Bellevue Literary Press read that, named Erica Goldman. And Erica got a hold of me and basically said, look, I am skeptical of all of these things you're talking about, but I couldn't find anything to be skeptical about in your essay, which really intrigued me. And she said, would you consider turning that into a book? And I thought I didn't think long, by the way. I was like, yeah, I can do that. Sure, why not? And then I proceeded not to do it because, I had a whole bunch of other things to do. And Erica's like, come on. Okay, let's do this. And I'm like, okay. So I really wrote that book for her. But I also wrote it for my students at Rice, who are primarily STEM, by the way, science, technology, engineering, and medicine. And I realized decades ago that teaching religion or teaching the study of religion at Rice is a fraught enterprise, because generally we use religious people, of course, as our cases. And I realized that my students were dismissing them out of hand with the argument, I think in their heads, I'm of course guessing here, with the argument that, oh, well, they didn't know their science. This is the 14th century. If they would have known their science, they wouldn't say these stupid things. So I said to myself, okay, let's use scientists, let's use engineers, let's use medical professionals. Same experiences, same weird shit. What do you say now? And of course, that backs them into a corner, and they have to say things like, "Oh, well, they just forgot their science, or they just had a bad moment, or something." I don't know what they say, but it's not very convincing. And so I wrote the flip. If you read the flip, first of all, it's very short, and it's focused mostly on scientists and engineers and medical professionals, because I wanted to show that these people too have these flips, by which I mean they were trained in this materialist-oriented worldview, whether that's medical science or physics or engineering, and then they have some kind of radical experience. It might be on a psychedelic, it might be a near-death experience, it might just be a spontaneous mystical event, and then they flip, and they realize that consciousness is actually not reducible to the material world. And they begin to speculate that maybe mind or consciousness has produced the material world, and maybe the physics or maybe the mathematics is a function of consciousness and not the other way around. And their physics or math or medicine isn't hurt at all. In fact, it's helped by this new metaphysical conviction. And so that's what I mean by the flip. I mean this flip from materialism to some form of consciousness as primary, that also is very pro-science, very pro-technology, very pro-medicine. So that's what that book is about. And I think it's also a really good book for people to start with, because it's short. You can read it in a day, and you can kind of get Jeff in a day rather than, the bigger books, which are harder to read.
Yeah. Awesome. And obviously the link for that and your other books is via the description if anybody's interested, or they should be. What are you, just to change pace a little bit and talk about UAP for a little while before we kind of trickle back into some of these other areas, because we're going to jump around a bit today and touch on a few different things. So what are your thoughts? This is going to be kind of a wide question. What are your thoughts on the UFO phenomenon in general, like the current state of affairs of this whole thing, and have your opinions changed post David Grusch?
So first of all, I was invited by the Soul Foundation at Stanford last November to give the final talk on the UAP, or the UFO phenomenon.
Yeah.
And I gave this talk called Shooting Down Souls. Good luck with that. And essentially what I argued is that there is a spectrum of phenomena in the UAP or UFO world. And by the way, of course, UAP is a modern way of talking about what we used to call the UFO. And they're trying to get away, I think, from the science fiction countercultural associations, which I happen to love. I think they're really useful. Yeah. It's sort of like not wanting to call psychedelics because of the hippies. I'm like, yeah, but the hippies were right about this. I mean, come on. So I just call it the UFO. And what I often say is that there's this spectrum, and this is Jacques Vallée as well. There's the sort of strange, which you can see in the science, which you can do physics or astronomy or genetics or whatever you want to do on the phenomena. But then you get these really, really strange experiences way over here. And those are what the humanist or the historian is much more interested in. Things like seeing 8-foot praying mantises in one's bedroom, or werewolf dogs in your backyard, and not just seeing them, but getting the shit scared out of you by these things. So all of that happens, and all of that's in the UFO phenomenon. And I think the sciences, again, are doing the easy stuff. They're doing important stuff, but it's easy. And I think the historian or the humanist is doing the hard stuff, and it's not easy. And no, we don't know what it is. I think where I'm at now is pretty much where I was at earlier. we don't know what this is, but it's something.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating to me about the David Grusch phenomena, the whistleblower phenomena, the congressional inquiry, is what was fascinating about the remote viewing program in the 70s and 80s and 90s that the US government ran. It's that you have government and military and intelligence interest in it. And it's public, and or it becomes public. And I think that's what's fundamentally changed around the phenomenon, is that the interest no longer invokes eye rolls or tinfoil hats. It's like it's Congress and the New York Times now. And it's just taken on a different urgency. It's also taken on a different seriousness and a different level of seriousness that I think is really, it's about time. But it's also all encoded in the history, which people have largely forgotten. People don't know that UFO was coined or as an acronym of the U.S. Air Force in the early 1950s. So this has always been a military concern. And most of the movies and most of the novels in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s were all what I call Cold War mythology expressions. They were really functions of the Cold War. And I think the mistakes of that moment. I think we are moving out of that, but only with fits and starts. And I'm trying to be one of the people who's saying, "Come on, let's get out of that story we've been telling, and let's tell a different story about this." And it's likely going to be wrong too, but at least it's better than this, aliens as invaders kind of thing that we were stuck in the Cold War.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on like the testimony of Grusch, like the things he's claimed? So like craft in possession of either the US government or of private corporations.
Yeah.
That being, the main.
Yeah.
One.
So as a researcher, as a historian, I don't have any access to that.
Yeah.
And, I don't doubt David Grusch, but I also don't have direct access to that. So I can't research or say anything authoritative about it. To kind of put it simply, when I write a book and I cite a source, anybody can go to that source and check out what Jeff just said. I have no source for those claims. And I'm sure David Grusch does, but he can't say what the source is. And so, for legal reasons. And I understand that. And so as a researcher, I'm just trying to be transparent and honest. Is I don't have any security clearances. I actually don't want them. And I can't say anything about that. And here's why. And so I just try to stay in my lane. And I think that frustrates some people, but I think it's also really honest. The other thing I say about the UFO is the reason it fascinates me, and I think the one reason it fascinates everyone, is because we don't understand it. If I had an explanation for it, I wouldn't be interested in it. Once we can explain something, we move on. And I think we're so taken with the UFO precisely because we don't know what it is. And as a historian of religions, I am deeply aware that there are all kinds of religious and mythological and folklore elements to it, which seem obvious to me. But they're only obvious after reading people like Jacques Vallée and John Kehill and Charles Fort, and being aware of this literature, that it's not just a nuts and bolts extraterrestrial model. It might be something else. It might actually be internal to the human species and part of our folklore, part of our history, part of our religions. So that to me is really interesting.
Could you expand on the idea that it could be like internal to us? That's interesting.
Yeah. So what I mean by that, I don't mean that Ben or Jeff is doing it. I don't mean internal to any particular individual, but I mean, look, it's engaging with the human species, which likely means it's part of the human species, or it's part of what people call consciousness today, or some kind of mindedness. I call it superhuman or non-human, drawing on a French researcher named Aimé Michel, who was writing in the 60s. It strikes me, just looking at it, just looking at the phenomena, that it often communicates with human beings, which suggests to me that it's related to us somehow.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you don't, listen, Ben, I don't communicate with species that are completely different from me. I actually eat them. Okay. So when I communicate with another being, that being is human in some sense, you know? And
Mm-hmm.
so a lot of this contact and communication that's going on, I think it's deeply human in the sense that it's superhuman. It's beyond the ego, you know, but it's also clearly related to our religions and our sense of the soul and revelation and all of these things that I think are really um, normal or historical to us.
Mm-hmm.
And by that I don't mean, you know, I should back up. I'm not giving you an example of the ancient alien hypothesis. I'm not saying that our religions are functions of a visiting extraterrestrial in the past. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that the whole mythology of the extraterrestrial is itself um, a kind of modern mythology that is related to these earlier mythologies. And we don't really know how they're related because we haven't tried to tease that out. But I'm not privileging the ancient mythologies, and I'm not privileging the modern extraterrestrial mythology. I'm saying they're all interpretations, they're all mythologies that have developed over time.
Mm-hmm. And you think, I suppose, that there could be, not saying necessarily whether there are or not, but could be multiple kind of phenomena or intelligences interacting with us in some sense. Do you think there is some kind of non-human extraterrestrial, however we want to put it, intelligence interacting with our planet?
So
I'm deeply
skeptical of the extraterrestrial hypothesis, Ben. I think it's naive, to be quite frank about it. And I say that as a historian of religions who studied the gods have been coming out of the sky for a long time. And historically, our ancestors framed these in religious terms as deities. Now we call them extraterrestrials. Okay, okay, go ahead. But I'm deeply suspicious of the historical religions, and therefore I'm deeply suspicious of the modern extraterrestrial stuff. Um, that doesn't mean I don't think there's a there. I just think it's always also a here. I think it's always a function of our attempts to create a worldview and a story or a folklore out of these experiences. I also think that our experiences are, this is the tough part. I think that the experiences themselves are encoded with these histories and these cultures. So one of the things I often say is I don't believe in beliefs, but I believe in belief.
Right.
By which I mean, when I sit down with an experiencer, I understand that experiencer had that experience, and I accept that, and I embrace that, and I think with that, but I don't sign my name to that worldview.
Mm-hmm.
Because
to their interpretation.
I firmly believe, Ben, and this is to get to the UFO question again, I firmly believe that this phenomenon is deceptive.
Mm-hmm.
That what's actually happening is not what we're seeing. It's camouflaging itself, or it's encoding itself. And I'm very familiar with deception and camouflage, by the way, from the biological world and from the human world. So again, it looks very human to me. It looks very biological. It looks very familiar, but all the more reason not to believe it.
Yeah. And it obviously begs the question of, like, why is it deceptive? Why would it want to go on?
Well, okay, so here's what we know about deception in the biological world. We know that deception is used for survival purposes, you know, to avoid predators, to avoid being eaten. We also know that deception is used for sexual reproduction. We know that. That's just a fact. We know that human beings engage in deception all the time, and that this is a sign of intelligence. And sometimes it's for perfectly good reasons, by the way. As I often say, take our, I don't want to say our dog, the species we live with, who we call
Companion animal.
Delilah, you know,
Yeah.
I take her to the veterinarian all the time, where things like teeth cleaning and shots and stuff. And Delilah has no idea why Jeff is doing that. And she shivers. She shivers when she sees the building.
Yeah.
She knows, okay, I'm deceiving her, but I'm doing it for what I perceive to be a good reason, to prevent her from
Mhm.
getting this heartworm, or so she doesn't have to get her teeth pulled out, or whatever the case might be. So
Yeah.
I don't think deception's necessarily bad, or much less sinister. I think it's part of the human condition, is part of the natural world, and I think it's what we're seeing in the UFO phenomenon again, but on
Mhm.
a grand scale now, not on Jeff taking Delilah to the veterinarian, but in the sky, or in the bedroom.
Yeah. Although hopefully it's as friendly as that. Hopefully the intentions are along those lines of
So
nothing, malicious.
okay, my view on that, Ben, I actually have a view on that. My view on that is, look, if it was malicious, we'd be toast a long time ago. You and
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't be sitting here. I mean, I think this thing has been around for hundreds of thousands of years, maybe millions. I think it's very familiar with us. It might be us, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's out to get us at all. Quite the contrary. It's probably trying to, adjust the knobs, as it were, on our cultures and on our ridiculous practices.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so no, I don't think I don't, as a whole, I understand that
Yeah.
sometimes people experience it in terrifying and fearful ways. But by the way, that's how people experience the sacred as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. It's different perspective and perception.
God can kill somebody as easily as God can redeem someone in the biblical view.
Mm-hmm.
And I think people forget that. They forget that terror and fear is a natural response to the sacred, and as is seduction, as is beauty, as is goodness, as is all these other things. It runs the whole gamut again.
Yeah. For the most part, I agree about the idea that if there's some kind of technologically advanced non-human intelligence here, they could easily have wiped us out by now. That seems fairly logical. But I will push back on the idea that, like, imagine one cow talking to another cow in a field, and he's like, "Oh, the humans are clearly not malicious because they could have wiped us out by now. We're thriving." Like,
right.
So there's obviously all different kinds of ways of looking at it.
You get that, no, you get that in the literature, and so you get the Earth as a farm theory,
Mm-hmm.
and that goes all the way back to Charles Fort, as far as I can see, in the 1920s. And and in terms of your pushback, or you agree or you don't agree, what I often say is, I don't care if you agree or don't agree. I don't care what you believe. I don't care what I believe, Ben. It's the conversation that matters. It's the debate. It's this podcast that really matters. And the idea that it's sinister and is eating us like we eat cows, I think,
for the
is
record,
really.
I don't necessarily think that's happening. I was just putting it out.
But that was what you just implied, but I think that's because you do get this theme in the literature,
Mm-hmm.
that the phenomena is feeding off of human emotion or human sexual arousal, that it has some kind of vampiric or symbiotic relationship to emotion or to desire. Okay, that's clearly part of the human experience too. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about that in a way that respects those experiences, but also puts them in this broader context, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
Um,
No, I agree. And again, for the record, I don't necessarily think that is the case, that we are being farmed. I just like to think, of alternate perspectives and see things from different angles.
I'll tell you another one. I'll tell you another one I get all the time, is that they're demons.
Mm. Yeah, I bet people bring that up to you a lot because of the religious stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm like, that's not very imaginative.
Yes.
And it just returns the phenomena back to one's worldview. That's all it does.
Yeah.
It's like, it's like this question I often ask, because I like throwing things into the mix that blow up the conversation, and I don't know where it'll go, and I don't. It's the provocation that I like. So one of the questions I really do like is, okay, would you baptize an alien? And my own answer is no. That's a really bad idea, and it's a really bad idea for two reasons. One is, first of all, the alien won't let you.
Yeah.
Okay, that's the first reason. The second reason is baptizing anyone is just pulling that person back into your worldview. In this
Yeah.
case, a religious Christian worldview.
Yeah.
Please don't do that. And I say the same thing to scientists. I say the same thing to Buddhists. I say the same thing to Muslims. Please don't pull this phenomena into your worldview, because your worldview actually can't explain it.
Mm.
Let's let the phenomena be the phenomena, and let's be provoked and changed by it. Let's not reduce it to our categories. And I say that to everyone, Ben, and I say that to myself. I'm the same way. And again, that's when I say I love the UFO because I don't understand it. I'm really sincere about that.
Mm-hmm.
I really don't know. And neither does anyone else.
Yeah.
And I guess that's the point I want to make. And that, I think that's surprising to people. And that's really important. Like, one of the reasons I think the US government is so savvy about covering this up is what they're covering up is ignorance.
Mm-hmm.
And a complete inability to protect our airspace from these threats, right? I don't think they're threats, by the way, and I don't think there's anything like airspace in an absolute sense. So I think the UFO is very useful and powerful there, but I don't think they understand what it is either.
Mm.
And by they, I don't even know who they is. I don't know who they. I mean, my question is, who's they? Who's they?
Yeah. Every question leads to another question.
Yeah.
Sage words about the idea of step outside of your worldview to analyze and look at these things and to kind of appreciate them without perspective, if it's even possible, but try to. About the they, who is they? A handful of people in the government that nobody knows their names, faceless, nameless people, and what do they know? Maybe more than we think, maybe less than we think. In general, the government is incompetent. That's
they certainly know other than we know. They probably know more in some aspects, but in other aspects, I don't think they do know what's going on, and they do know as much. And again, this is my reverence for historians and humanists. They actually know a lot, Ben, and they can say a lot about this if they would. And that's sort of my goal in the academy, is just to get colleagues talking about it.
Yeah.
Again, it's not to arrive at answers.
Yeah. It's all about the discussion. You wrote the Supernatural with Whitley Strieber. His experiences are well known by people that are interested in the UFO phenomenon and all this kind of thing. So, what are your thoughts on that phenomenon, the abduction phenomenon? This element of it seems to be connected to UFOs, but whether it is or not, it very much seems to be connected to UFOs. Is it a real phenomenon? Is it a physical phenomenon? What are your thoughts on it?
Well, much as what I just said, I don't think we know what it is. And I wrote the book with Whitley, I think 2016 or something, and it's called The Supernatural. Three words.
Yeah.
And the space is crucial.
Did I say it too fast? Sorry.
No, it's okay. It's okay. But people generally wouldn't understand that it's a different conception of the anomalous. The supernatural, one word now, is a medieval category that intellectuals came up with in the 13th century to talk about how God is outside the natural world and is intervening in the natural world through what they called miracles. The supernatural is my gloss on the paranormal, by the way, because people don't like the word paranormal for, I think, really bad reasons, by the way. But they don't like the word. I'm like, okay, you don't like the word. How about the supernatural? And essentially what it means is these phenomena are part of our world, but they are not explainable in terms of our contemporary science. And so that's what we mean by the expression. I wanted to work with Whitley because I realized that, first of all, his book Communion, which came out in 1987, is really what sets the dials for the whole contact experience that comes after it. People recognized the entity on the cover, painted by Ted Jacobs, and they wrote Whitley in the hundreds of thousands. So there was something about that book that struck a nerve in 1987 that I think is really important. And I wanted to sit down with Whitley, and I wanted, basically, the argument of that book is that encoded in Whitley's experiences is a whole theory of religion, and we need to tease out that theory. And Whitley wouldn't call it religion, by the way. He would call it something like a theory of reality, or a theory of the world, or something else. But I wanted to sit with Whitley for years, and the way that book works is he has a chapter on a set of experiences, and then I give a chapter on what the study of religion and culture would say about it, and it just goes like that for many times. And so the book as a whole is very much a dialogue between someone in the academy and someone in the science fiction world, writing about, in this case, his own experiences. I've been with Whitley a lot. His letters, the letters that came to him after Communion, sit in our Archives of the Impossible now. That whole series of events is very important to me. I don't think Whitley understands it either, but I think he does have some views about it that I definitely listen to and I definitely take seriously. And those views, basically, that we articulate in the book, is that it might have some non-human or supernatural dimension to it, but we don't know because we haven't really tried to ask that question in a systematic and disciplined way. But that his experiences in 1987 and afterwards are really important culturally as kind of cultural touchstones of the contact movement and the abduction movement. And by the way, not every experiencer likes the word abduction.
Yeah.
Because it presumes a kind of non-agency, which is often present, by the way. It also suggests a kind of rape if it's sexualized, which is also present sometimes, including in Whitley's experiences. Which is also, by the way, extremely familiar to the historian of religions. I can tell you about erotic and abduction experiences all the way far as we can see in history. So none of that surprises me in the least, but I'm fascinated how it's getting reframed and rethought in the contemporary world.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's an answer to your question, Ben, but I think of the abduction experience as I think about possession and mediumship and channeling and mystical experience in the history of religions. I think about it in those terms. And that's not to say they're adequate. That's not to say our ancestors are adequate. I don't think they are. But I think they had real insight as well. And we need to listen to that insight, and we need to develop our own ideas about it and kind of move forward.
Yeah. You asked if you answered the question, and as you said earlier, it's not really about answers. We're never really going to get answers, but you did some good talking. You talked nicely about my question, so I'm happy with that.
I tried. I mean, the book's what, 200-300 pages long. I mean, it's one long answer to that question, and that's the conversation I want us to have.
Yeah. This question is inspired by Liam. He's a regular commenter on my YouTube. Do you think the abduction phenomenon, if physically real, is one of the reasons for secrecy about UFOs? Are there any other problematic behaviors related to the UFO phenomenon that may be making disclosure harder to come by?
I do think, so if you look, thank you for that question. If you look at how the phenomenon's discussed, at least in the US, it slices off that abduction element. It just pretends that these are objects in the sky. And you asked the question earlier whether they're connected, whether the abduction phenomenon, the UFO phenomenon. Well, they're certainly connected in a lot of the stories and a lot of the experiences. Um, so I suspect they are connected, but again, how, we don't know. I do think that this thing that's cut off is part of why it's so difficult to talk about this phenomenon. I think, at least in the US, again, we're very good talking about material technology and physical things in the sky. We're very bad at talking about ecstatic religious events, because what happens is, again, it gets framed in traditional religious terms. These become demons, or this becomes angels, or some other familiar term. And again, I don't think any of that's the case. I think those are all earlier approximations of something that's been happening a long time to human beings.
Mm-hmm. You said in your, sorry, go on.
Well, there was a second part to the question.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other disturbing elements of the UFO? And the answer is yes. There is occasional violence and non-agency in a lot of these events, including implants, by the way, which is another really disturbing phenomena that we see in the literature, and certainly in the experiencers. So yeah, there is actually stuff that's disturbing. It's disturbing to whom, though, I guess is how I would push the question. I think it's disturbing to a rationalist, materialist, secular framework. It's not necessarily disturbing to an indigenous framework, or to a Black framework, or to an occult or esoteric framework. It actually makes a lot of sense. Does that mean we understand what it is? No. Let me put this. I really want to emphasize this point. Symbol and myth and folklore are not literally true, but they may be necessary to how the phenomenon appears. And it's that paradox that I think we need to inhabit. In other words, I'll give you a Whitley Strieber example again, which I've talked about a lot. We once pushed Whitley on this question of, well, you're a science fiction and horror writer. Of course, you had this experience in 1987. It's great science fiction and horror, isn't it? And Whitley's answer has stuck with me and become a kind of key to my thinking. What he said was, look, of course I know that the visitors in 1987 were related to the bad science fiction movies I saw in the 50s and 60s. I know that. I'm not an idiot. But there was a there. They were manifesting through those movies and images. And so what we need to do now is make better movies, make better science fiction movies. And I was like, you're caught in a circle there, right? It's like you never get out of this circle, but you can make it better. And his argument was essentially, we need to make better science fiction movies so our descendants can have better experiences. And I was like, oh my God, that's right. That's exactly it. And so this is what I most want to say is, what is appearing is not what is there, but it might be appearing in the only way it can.
Yeah.
And another image I give is the stained glass window in my home church in Nebraska. It has all these biblical images on the right side and all these Marian images on the left side as you face the altar. And all of those images and stories are based on history and texts and people's strange experiences. But there's still a sunlight. There's still light coming through the window, and it's getting shaped by the historical experience of my own ancestors. I don't particularly believe those biblical stories or those Marian apparitions as they are literally believed, but I think there is a light shining through them. So can you sit with that paradox? Because what that allows me to do then, Ben, is say, well, the same light is evident in the Hindu case and the Muslim case and the Jewish case and the Navajo case and the, on and on and on. This is how the phenomena has always appeared to human beings, is through their folklore and mythology and their stained glass windows, as it were. And it's the only way it can appear because, well, actually, I would back up a bit there. I think there are individuals who experience the light outside the windows, but they realize that the windows are just the windows and not the light. And they become deeply suspicious of their own cultural and family backgrounds. So I do think human beings are capable of knowing that light, but it's really exceptional to do so. And you're not seeing it today, certainly in Congress or the public conversations around the UFO. You're kind of lost in the windows.
Yeah. Many people listening will be familiar with the miracle of the sun in Fatima. Are there any other maybe one or two events where in your mind it's very similar to the contemporary UFO from the historical text that you'd like to mention? And maybe you said there might be some in the historical text regarding implants as well?
Yeah, I mean, again, those are huge questions.
Yeah. And I'm putting you on the spot, totally.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I'll mention a couple colleagues and then a biblical text. My colleague Diana Pasulka has written a lot about Teresa of Avila.
Yeah.
Who, by the way, levitated against her own wishes, by the way. She would do things like ask the nuns to pile on top of her when these noble ladies were visiting so she wouldn't float off the ground, which, it seems reasonable. But she had this amazing vision of this burning something, punching a sharp object into her, she says, her entrails, and she moans and in delight, but also in pain. And Diana interprets this as an early kind of, or as a medieval or late medieval abduction experience. And I would also mention Carlos Ayer, who wrote this wonderful book called They Flew. And what he shows, I think, definitively in the book is that levitation is actually really common in 17th century Italy and Spain in particular, but that it gets picked up differently. It gets interpreted differently. The Catholics interpret it one way, or actually in many ways, but the Protestants inevitably interpret it in demonological terms. And people lift off the ground in different circumstances, Ben. Mm-hmm. Sometimes in states of holiness or sanctity, but also in states of possession, and today in state of UFO abductions, by the way. So again, those are all the stained glass windows for me. People are actually lifting off the ground quite outside their control, by the way.
Yeah.
It's often quite terrifying, by the way, not at all pleasant. So I want to get away from this notion that there's some kind of intentional fraud. I mean, the idea that these people are, I don't know, lifting up on their toes or pretending to float or something, I think is ridiculous. I think we just let that one go and just say, okay, they floated, they flew. What does that mean? But again, it's the interpretations that differ so dramatically. So those are historical cases. The biblical case that's always mentioned here is Ezekiel chapter 1. Mm-hmm. And if you just read it, it's really hard not to read that biblical case as some kind of UFO event. I don't know how you do it. And of course, that vision of the four weird animals and the divine man on the machine or whatever it was that abducted Ezekiel appears again and again in the UFO literature and even in film, and I think for a good reason. So I think this experience is ancient. I don't think it's a contemporary or modern one, although it is also a contemporary or modern one. Yeah. So there was a second part to your question.
Was there?
I don't know.
I don't even know. I think my question was long ago. I think we've just kind of moved on and it's evolved.
You asked about religious
about the other
like Fatima,
and the implants,
Oh, the implant. Okay, so let me say a word about Fatima or Fatima before I go on to the implant. I grew up with Our Lady of Fatima. I used to pray the rosary to her as a statue, on the wall of the church, and the three children. And I knew the whole story, as as it was relayed to me through the Catholic Church, which had framed it and interpreted it in a very Marian, pious way. What I later learned is that there's more to the story, and that the children actually didn't know what they saw. They just called it a little lady. And it gets framed as the Blessed Virgin for sure, as the visions go on over 6 months, by the way. She promises to reappear every 6 months on a particular day. And she does, by the way, just like clockwork. Yeah. And the miracle of the sun, as it's called, occurs in October on her 6th and last visit. But those events are central to the UFO literature as well. And it turns out that 2 of the children are dead within a few years after that event. One of probably some kind of cancer, but we don't really know. And that the third visionary was basically imprisoned, that's my word. She was basically put in a convent and sealed through silence and obedience, which I find that very strange and it's very Catholic. I understand why a young woman would do that, but that only one of the visionaries survives and that she herself is vowed to silence around these events. She does later write about them, but of course in a very Catholic devotional way. Yeah. I'm just trying to articulate again, I'm very suspicious of the stained glass. I'm very suspicious of the statue in the church, although I get it. I really do get it. I really do get why people pray their rosaries to the vision, but I suspect it's something ufological and not just Marian, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. And yeah, the implants, was there anything that came to mind about a case with
implants. Okay. The thing that fascinates me about implants is, again, that they happen. I mean, this is what experiencers talk about endlessly. And they're not, they're also have no agency. They're usually forced onto the person. They're often found accidentally later on. They seem to be some kind of tracking device. We also implant, by the way, we do implant things into animals to track them. But when these objects are looked at under electron microscopes and stuff, they don't look like technology. Although sometimes they behave like weird technology. In Whitley's case, it crawled back up into his ear when they tried to surgically remove it. Okay, well, what is that about? That's, and I've seen Whitley's ear. I've seen it turn bright red in situations where he claims that it turned on, and I don't have any reason to doubt Whitley's claims. And so I'm just fascinated. But if you listen to Whitley's description of how that implant was put in his ear, it's pretty violent. And it has nothing to do with his own wishes or will. And so I want to just honor those stories. And the reason I am so fascinated by them is that, again, there's non-agency, but they're also very physical. I'm really want us to get away from this idea that religious experiences are just in your head. Mm-hmm. And that they're hallucinations. I want to say, no, they're also about the physical world, and they're interacting with physics. I mean, when people float, that there's some kind of anti-gravitation going on. Yeah. There's also some kind of altered state that's happening. And guess what? They go together. Okay, what does that mean? I don't know what that means, but can't we just be honest that there's an altered state and there's an anti-gravitation phenomenon going on? Can't we just say that? I mean, I just did, but that's, as I say, impossible.
Yeah, exactly. I was just looking at the word behind you and had it in my head ringing like, but it's impossible, Jeff. People can't fly, right?
It is. But the reason I love the category of the impossible is because it's only impossible in your framework, Ben. It's only impossible by today's scientific standards, which we know will change, by the way. We know that. I mean, science always changes. Our understanding of the world changes dramatically from century to century. So I find impossible phenomena really useful and powerful as anomalies to whatever the worldview is. And so my answer is, well, change your damn worldview. You know, don't deny the phenomena. Just change. And I guess some people find that impossible. They find that too hard to do, so they fall back on their worldview, whether that's a secular scientific one or a Catholic one.
Yeah. When did you first stumble across the phenomenon of human levitation? And like, was it after your flip, and so you were able to digest it, or was it? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I knew about it, of course, even as a kid, but I guess I assumed, certainly in graduate school, that it was just an exaggerated kind of legendary thing. Certainly by 2007 or 8 or so, I was having second and third thoughts. And by 2018 or so, I was actually invited once to a salon at MIT to talk about human levitation and UFOs.
Yeah.
And
I was like, ask you about this.
Yeah, I was like, wow, that's really interesting. And what the propulsion scientist is an engineer told me was that they're pretty sure that UFOs don't fly by ordinary propulsion methods, which basically, for the layperson, i.e. myself, basically means blowing shit out the back of an aircraft, right? You have a controlled explosion.
Burning shit.
Yeah, you're exploding gas out the back of a machine, and it's propelling it forward. And the UFO, as we know from many witnesses, are entirely silent, and they just kind of float through the sky effortlessly. And this propulsion engineer told me, well, we think it has something to do with space-time metric engineering. And I was like, wow, that is so cool. That's a great phrase. I have no idea what that means, but okay. But I was fascinated by his link. He linked human levitation and UFOs, by the way. I didn't do that. He made the link, and then he asked me to talk about those. And I said, yeah, I can do that. It's probably not going to help, but I can do that. And so that's what I did. I went up to Cambridge and I talked about Joseph of Cupertino and UFO accounts. And I don't think it helped, but I had told them that. So
yeah, well, maybe it did. Maybe you're not giving yourself enough credit. Are there any like things you like specifically remember from that talk that you'd want to share now that were interesting takeaways or things that you highlighted?
Well, just the fact that it happened fascinated me. I actually gave a talk on the same trip over at Harvard. Harvard and MIT are right next to one another. And my colleague Charlie Stang invited me over to Harvard to give a talk on UFOs. And so I called it Biological Gods. And I talked about the UFO phenomenon. And what I remember about that event is that they couldn't get everybody in the room. There was so much interest in it that it was overwhelming in some sense. And then Charlie went over with me to MIT because I'm sure he wanted to see how this would go. He's like, okay, Jeff's going to go talk to the scientists and engineers, and this has got to be good. But they were really friendly to me, and they were really receptive. And my sense of them, this is just anecdotal or intuitive, was that there was a lot of sympathy and support for what I was doing, but also a sense of I don't know how to engineer or operationalize any of this, and that's what engineering really is. It's essentially a taking of physics and turning it into a technology and something that we can control and reproduce. And I was not talking about reproduction or using these phenomena. I was talking about human beings to whom these things happen in an unwilling fashion.
Yeah.
And so that's really what I came away with. But I also came away with a profound sense of propulsion, by the way, and what's at stake in a lot of this interest.
Yeah, it's fascinating. The whole human levitation thing is one of the most mind-boggling things I came across on this, this journey of researching phenomena. It's obviously goes against everything, we learned as children and we grew up with, and it's just like totally outside the box. But yeah, read the accounts, as you said, and I interviewed Michael Grosso talking about Joseph of Cupertino, and yeah, so many people observed the phenomena and attested to that, and it wasn't just
I have a colleague and friend named Dale Allison, who's a New Testament critic who at Princeton Seminary College, and he wrote a book called Encountering Mystery, and I think it begins with this story. If not, it's very much towards the beginning. There's this, and I can so see this as a human being. There's this little girl dressed up, by the way, in a Supergirl costume, right? And she's on, I think she's on a ledge, or she's on one of these things that painters use to paint inside, these high
easel,
stack. What's it?
Do you mean an easel, or is there something?
There's an American term for them. I can never think of. But she was way high up.
Okay, so not an easel. No,
and she fell. Right. And her mother, of course, screams. There's nothing her mother can do. And she falls, and then she just slows way down and just kind of gently lands on the ground. And of course, nothing's hurt, and there's no broken bones. She's not dead. I mean, that would kill most people.
Yeah.
And, Dale, I think, begins with this story just to sort of say, look, I mean, these things happen all the time, and we don't know how, but there's something going on here that is worth listening to and worth thinking about our worldview and ourselves. And I personally think it's relevant that she was wearing a Supergirl costume. I mean, I think those fantasies and those popular cultural forms are ways that we do entertain this, but only as fiction or entertainment, not as part of the real world.
Yeah, I can see your book up there about the superheroes. I can't see.
Yeah. I mean, I wrote a whole book, Mutants and Mystics, about this very thing, and I really believe. I think superpowers are real. Are they exaggerated? Yes, of course. Of course, they're exaggerated. We don't walk around in spandex and blow stuff up. That's not how it works. But do we see the future? Do we lift off the ground? Do we communicate with each other? Yeah. Unconsciously, absolutely, we do, all the time. So my question to Hollywood is always, can you do this without spandex and things blowing up? And their answer to me is always no. And I'm like, why not? And then they say, well, we know what works, and we know what makes money, and we're not going to take a risk on something we don't know. And I'm like, okay, at least that makes sense. I get your answer,
Yeah, but as you said, I'd like to see something a bit more realistic. Yeah, toned down, no spandex, like much lesser abilities, but still interesting things filtering through. But yeah, anyway.
Well, a film on Joseph of Cupertino would be amazing.
That would be incredible.
That'd be awesome. And I don't mean a devotional one. I mean, let's do it right. Do it. Do it. It's all its complexity and all of its contorted nature. Don't cover over the warts.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, thank you for sharing the anecdote of the girl that fell with the superhero costume. Not to make light of that incredible event, but if I was the mother or whatever was there, I probably would have tried selling that costume, at least getting an agreement in principle before leaving. Who wants to buy this superhero costume that actually saves your child when they fall? And
Ben, there are literally tens of thousands, if not millions, of those stories. I'm just telling you stuff I've read,
Yeah.
So there's like this hopelessly relative and focused sort of cut through this. But I just think that if you scratch the surface of almost anyone's life, you're going to find an event like that.
Yeah, maybe not quite exactly like that, but you're going to find extraordinary events that make you question everything. One thing we talked about your Soul Foundation talk a little bit recently. One of the things you said in there, I can't remember the wording you used, but something along the lines of you were intrigued by the future human hypothesis. And as much as I know that you don't want to, like put all your eggs in one basket or lean too far in any one direction, can you, give me some of your thoughts and ideas about that hypothesis?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I often say that, if I find any hypothesis plausible or attractive, it's the future human hypothesis. And the reason I find it so attractive is this move from a spatial framework to a temporal one. And I need to explain that. So when you talk about UFOs, you'll always have some astronomer or cosmologist tell you that the stars are too far apart for interstellar time. I'm like, oh, yeah, what the fuck? I mean, just stop it. I know that. But what if these things aren't coming from another space at all? What if they're coming from another time, on the same planet? Then suddenly the spatial framework is irrelevant, and if you look closely at the behavior of UFO accounts or contacts, they look a lot like things are traveling through time and not traveling through space. And I'm relying on my colleague Michael Masters, who's an evolutionary anthropologist here, but I'm also relying on Jacques Vallée and a lot of the accounts where, the object just appears out of nowhere and then disappears, or the inhabitants of the craft appears human but not quite human. I mean, they're like they're essentially what you would imagine. They're kind of faking it, in some way. Mm-hmm. So it has this sort of staged kind of quality to it. So I don't know. It just looks to me like this is how future humans would interact with past humans. And also, if I was a future human, which I suppose I am to past humans, I would be really concerned about things like nuclear energy.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what you find, actually, when you look at the literature. You find a lot of UFO anxiety around power plants and missile silos. And that, to me, makes a tremendous amount of sense, because this is exactly how a future human species would interact with its own past, by the way. And they would be really concerned that its own, I always get descendants and ancestors mixed up, how its own ancestors wouldn't basically blow it, blow it up in this case. And nuclear bombs are a way we could end human civilization, today.
Yeah.
They're very, very apocalyptic in a literal sense. And I don't just mean human civilization. I mean most of the living planet would end in a full-blown exchange. So if I were a future human, that's what I would be most concerned about. And if you think of the UFO mythology as a whole now, what you realize is that most of it has occurred after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's really a post-World War II phenomenon. It's a Cold War phenomenon. And that it definitely revolves around nuclear energy and human mutation, by the way. So that's why I often say I like the future human hypothesis, because it gets around or makes irrelevant the spatial objections to the extraterrestrial hypothesis.
Yeah. Thank you for outlining, your thoughts on that. That is interesting, and it is an intriguing hypothesis. I've spoken to Michael Masters, and I do find it very interesting.
And Michael
kind of breaks my brain a little bit.
Michael, of course, is not the only person to have said that. I mean, that theory goes back decades and decades, if not actually hundreds or thousands of years. I don't see that as Michael brings a new rigor to it, but it's actually a very, very old idea.
What are your I mean, we've talked about levitation, and we talked about a few other maybe possible answers to this question, but what are your thoughts on other potential commonalities, links, connections, gray areas, parallels, whatever, between UFO, psi phenomena, parapsychological stuff, the afterlife, religion, all of these areas? This is kind of a big question, but does anything come to mind when I talk about commonalities and links?
Well, so first of all, I talk about the trash can problem. And the trash can problem is, you throw everything you don't understand and that you think's wacky in the trash can, and then you shake it up. And then you say, well, I don't understand the UFO, Well, that's because you've mixed it up with a whole bunch of other stuff that's wacky. And okay, so there's that. But again, I don't think we've begun to tease apart what's different and what's similar about these different phenomena, because we've all taken them off the table and we've thrown them in this trash can, this proverbial trash can. So what I'm calling for is that we take them out of the trash can and we put them right on our table, and we start to look at them closely, and we start to tease apart what's connected and what's not. And I'll give you a good example. I'll give you a couple examples. One is cryptids or monster. You can call them monsters, I guess. So fortunately or unfortunately, they often appear alongside UFOs. Okay, well, UFO people don't like that. And I doubt that Bigfoot hunters like that either, because they're both literalizing the phenomena. They think it's a nuts and bolt craft, or they think it's an actual biological species. But what if it's not? What if it's some kind of apparition or some kind of occult phenomena that is showing up together? So those are the questions that I do have, and that other people have had. Those aren't original, Ben, but I think that's the kind of place we can go to show how these are connected. But it involves challenging these other hypotheses that I think need to be challenged.
Yeah. On the subject of extreme phenomena associated with religions, as per levitation, what are your thoughts on some of the other stuff, like incorruptible body phenomenon, bilocation, to go for possibly the most extremely challenging to our worldview, of all of them? And are there any others as well that come to mind along these lines?
Bilocation is, again, part of the literature. It goes way back, but it's not always physical bilocation. In other words, the person bilocates, but is in a vision or an apparition or something at the other place, not necessarily in the body. So, to me, bilocation is similar to telepathy, or similar to some kind of projection of the mind or the person across space and time. But it's not as impossible to me as levitation is. That to me is the real mind breaker. Something we haven't talked about that I do think ties a lot of this all together is trauma. And this gets back to the extremity part. And this also gets back to the skeptical move. Skeptics will often say, well, you cannot reproduce this in a laboratory, therefore it's not real. To which I always reply, of course you can't reproduce it in a laboratory. A laboratory is safe and boring, frankly. And these things appear in the wild in extreme and physically traumatic or emotionally traumatic or sexually traumatic situations. These are clearly related to human beings being broken down and split apart. And once you realize that, suddenly a lot of things begin to make a lot of sense. So, for example, take psychedelics. Psychedelics make a lot of sense because they're essentially traumatizing the brain. They're essentially splitting the person open. Meditation makes a lot of sense because you're essentially taking part of the human being offline, and you're allowing other parts of the human being to come online. Near-death experiences make a lot of sense because by definition, they're physically traumatic. The person almost died. That's why the event happened. They had a heart attack. They were in a car accident. They were raped. They were struck by lightning. Whatever the case might be, something really, really traumatic happened to them. And then they have this completely flipped, transformative experience. And if you look at UFO events, you often also find this kind of trauma or this kind of illness. Not always, but often you do find a kind of a real conflict. It might be emotional or physical or social or sexual, but it's a real conflict. And it seems to be partly responsible for these events. And I don't say that, Ben, in a reductive way. I'm not saying that the near-death experience is a product of the car accident. Mm-hmm. I'm saying you need the car accident to have the near-death experience. That's a very different argument than this reductive argument. And it also explains for me why these things cannot be reproduced in a laboratory. You can't kill people actually in a laboratory in an ethical way. And my joke is, you don't go to the North Pole to look for zebras. Yeah. If you do, guess what? You're not going to find zebras. And you're going to say there's no such thing as zebras. That's because you didn't go to Africa where zebras live. It's not because there are no zebras, right? And this is my argument against the skeptical reply that it's not a laboratory science. It's like, that's exactly where you go to make the phenomena disappear. It's exactly what you do. You turn it into an experiment or a kind of safe replication, and of course it doesn't appear because it's first of all, it's alive and intelligent. It doesn't want to appear, but secondly, it's not the context. There's no trauma involved.
Mm-hmm. Although, as you said near the beginning of our talk, like the laboratory experiments on this kind of stuff, whilst not like significant in the sense they show like superhero level stuff, they're significant in the sense that they show a consistent something.
Yeah. So this is where I'm often misheard. It's not that I'm against parapsychology. I think it's wonderful. And the statistical differences or the statistical evidence is, I think, overwhelming. But it's not going to convince anyone. No, it's not going to trip people. When people have these flips, guess what? They're convinced instantly. Even if they're scientists or engineers or medical, they're like, holy shit, I was wrong. I was wrong about it. Now, they're not all convinced. There are people who have had these experiences who still hold to a kind of reductive explanation. So I want to acknowledge that. But for the most part, they are. And I want to be the historian again in the room. I want to be the humanist. And I'm interested in human experience. That's spontaneous and historical and, part of a life cycle. It's not something that's controlled and reproduced in a sterile environment. So that's my critique, or that's my observation. It's not, there's nothing to the science or there's nothing to the parapsychology. Of course there is. The stuff's very real.
Yeah.
And I think what the parapsychologists are doing is they're showing that it's always at work in the background. It's a kind of low hum in the background that we don't recognize, but it's very much there. I think that's extremely valuable.
Yeah.
But I think generally you're convinced of that when you're already convinced of that. And then you read them and you achieve a different level of sophistication and scientific rigor, but you're probably not going to be convinced if you're of the materialist point of view.
I think it can play its part though, which I don't think you're disagreeing with. But for me, it was you said you had a gradual kind of flip, and I kind of had, or I'm still potentially going through something similar, and that definitely kind of was a few steps of my journey, reading The Conscious Universe by Dean Radin and going into all the statistics and like that was kind of shocking to me. It was like, whoa, okay, so what do I do now?
The other thing, we haven't talked about this, Ben, but the other thing that I often say is I think it's also really cool. I think this is wonderful.
Yeah.
This new view of the human. And I think that mostly what people in my world do academics do is really depressing. It's true. It's absolutely the case, but it's depressing and it's a bummer. And so I want people, I don't want people to stop being critical, but I want them also to acknowledge the positive and the ecstatic. I want them to do both. I don't want them to do one or the other. And so I think there's two tracks, as I often say. There's the, is it real or not track, but there's also the, okay, how do we talk about it track? How do we articulate this in a culture track? Yeah. And I think that's where things like podcasts and film and media come in, and art in a big way.
Yeah. Orbs are something we haven't touched on yet. I wanted to ask you about that. You're pretty well placed as like a religious historian with an interest in the UFO phenomenon. Obviously, these things seem to show up in, you know, cases with apparitions, cases of mediumship. They show up around UFOs. So there are all these different kind of types of phenomena in it, and obviously, depending on the case, they might seem like they are some kind of discarnate consciousness or a soul. In other cases, maybe we can question if it's some kind of technological, you know, vehicle that's coming out of what seems to be a craft. They also, I understand, appear in religious texts and that kind of thing. So you're well placed to answer, but again, no answer, no, we're not going to arrive at the meaning of life here. But what are your thoughts on orbs and where they fit into all of this thing? Do you, yeah.
Well, again, I just think I'll repeat myself. I think orbs have, you just said it. I mean, orbs have been appearing for a very long time. And, you know, the nature of them as circular or spherical is, to me, really interesting. It suggests something about their nature or the appearance of them. Even in I just got done writing about this 19th century text called Flatland. And in Flatland, it's a very humorous sort of parable, and there's this central character named A Square who lives on this two-dimensional plane called Flatland, and he gets abducted, and that's really what happens. The A Square gets abducted by a sphere. And hauled up into the third dimension or into up, and he realizes, oh my God, there's an up, you know. And then he goes back into Flatland, and guess what? He can't convince anybody that that there's an up. But it's a sphere.
That's cool.
There's a sphere. It's an orb that pulls him out, and so I guess what I'm trying to say here is I suspect that these orbs sometimes, not always, but sometimes are spiritual or soul-like in nature, and that they're trying to initiate people or abduct people into some kind of other perception of reality. That would be my guess. And again, not always. Again, we need research here. I mean, do we have a book on orbs in the history of human civilization? No, we do not. No, why not? Why do we think they're just dust specks in modern cameras or something? I mean, that's kind of weird.
Hopefully somebody listening is going to write the book. And
I hope so.
Dedicate it to Jeff Kripal.
Well, don't dedicate it to me, because we need such a book, you know. And it's the same with glowing humans, or, you know, orbs around human heads is another one. And okay, we do have books on the aura or on light forms, but we don't really have a big comparative book on glowing humans.
Yeah, which sounds pretty fascinating. I think maybe Diana mentioned that when I spoke with her as well. Yeah, that's interesting. Does that come up a lot, or have you just seen a few cases like that?
I'm actually thinking of Dale Allison there. I mean, Dale has written, the New Testament critic again, Dale has written beautifully of the resurrection, by the way, and things like the rainbow body, and
that's
people appearing, dead husbands appearing to widows. That's another one that's really common. And by appearing, I don't mean in an apparition. I mean they physically appear to their widowers, and the widow's like, what, you know. I mean, so that's really fascinating, you know. And it throws real light on something like the resurrection. It kind of puts it in a context that, again, I don't think Christian orthodoxy likes, but I think ultimately affirms, you know, a kind of religious sensibility around it.
Jacques Vallée is a close mentor of yours. I was just wondering, what are the most valuable insights that you've gleaned from him, or the most important things you've learned from him in the time you spent together?
Yeah. So a number of things, but I think I can. I've been thinking and writing a lot about Jacques, as you
Yeah.
probably know. Um, and Jacques has been very revealing about his personal life and his thoughts and his journals in particular. They're into 6 volumes now, organized by decades. So we know a lot about Jacques Vallée's life and his thoughts. And the thing I have taken from Jacques, well, the thing I took from him early on in books like Passport to Magonia and The Invisible College was this vast interdisciplinary approach that was both humanistic and historical, but also scientific and secular. And so I took from Jacques this really delicious refusal to locate oneself in a scientific or a humanistic worldview.
Mm.
And I loved that. I thought that was amazing.
Yeah.
Then in books like The Invisible College and in the journals in particular, what attracts me to his thought or his person so much is this idea that human beings can experience the secret, but that when they express it or when it shows up in apparitional form, it's always going to take on this local or cultural context, and that we should be suspicious of that local mythology or that local folklore. But that doesn't mean human beings cannot know the secret, as it were. But it's going to remain a secret. It's not going to be able to be pushed into our rationality or into our scientific categories. So that to me is the real takeaway. My own takeaway from Jacques is that, again, there's a there's a secret. Human beings can access it, but we don't know what it is, and no one knows what it is, including, by the way, Jacques Vallée. And he would be the first to say that. I mean, his joke is, why am I the only person in this UFO world that doesn't know what a UFO is? And it's a joke, but it's a gut punch. It's like, yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So I deeply admire him. His fusion of science and, say, esotericism, which is another way of putting it, I find extremely attractive, and I think it's basically the right way to go.
Yeah, we don't know what it is, and that's
well, we don't know, but human beings have encountered it, and I mean there's a kind of double claim there. There's we can do the science, which is sometimes superficial but necessary, and the esotericism is important too, but that doesn't mean we believe in any particular esoteric worldview. But there is a secret there. There is a there.
Yeah. This question is from one of my original patrons, Joe. I'm reading David Kaiser's book on how the hippies saved physics, which is about the philosophical and psychedelic adventures of the 1960s and 70s theoretical quantum physicists. Do you think that the UFO/paranormal research community is retreading old ground in terms of the investigation of quantum physics and consciousness studies? It feels like a lot of these issues are re-emerging into the discussion after a long hiatus. We could say the same thing about the UFO issue, which was buried for several decades and has now taken on new life post-2017.
Yeah, I think Joe's right about that. So I know, first of all, I've read David Kaiser's book. I know it well. The hero of it's Nick Herbert, who's a dear friend of mine and was very important to the physics of consciousness meetings at Esalen, at the Esalen Institute in the late 70s and early 80s. And so I know a lot about that book and that era. And I also know that someone like Nick is very interested in all of these topics, but also very questioning about what they have to do with physics. It's possible that consciousness is not a physical thing at all and has nothing to do with physics. That physics is about the material world and is a product of consciousness, but it's not itself conscious. not its self-consciousness. I do think, to get closer to Joe's question, I do think we're retreading a lot of old ground.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that people generally are not aware of the history, are not aware of the literature. And I see it as my own role to keep reminding people, well, we addressed this a long time ago. Here are the books, here are the essays, here are the people. And we didn't figure it out then. And guess what? You're not going to figure it out now. And I do think that historical awareness is really important. And I mean really important. I don't mean just for historians. And let me give you an example. The contemporary fascination with AI,
Mm-hmm.
AI this, AI that.
Yeah.
And suddenly the computer is the set of metaphors that is somehow going to explain mind or consciousness for us. Okay. Well, if you know something about the history of technology, the history of science, your gut suspicion is that's nonsense. Because we've gone through many technologies. The world used to be a gigantic clock, Then the telegraph produced this word telepathy. Then it was radio and mental radio and telepathy again. Then it was the television. Now it's the computer. And I'm like, well, so what? It's like the computer's not going to do it either, folks. It's not going to work. At what point are we going to realize that we're doing all of this, and that all of this technology is us? And so the computer is not going to explain consciousness. Consciousness is going to explain the computer, and already has, of course. So I think it's that flip again that is so crucial here. And I derive things from this, like through history, like Alan Turing, who was the gay code breaker and was so influential in the early era of artificial intelligence. First of all, he was totally convinced that telepathy is real.
Mm-hmm.
And his argument about computers and consciousness was, well, what a computer needs to do to really prove consciousness is be telepathic. And of course, it's not going to be. Yeah. And therefore, it's not human consciousness you can mimic consciousness. You can do the whole Chinese room thing, and you can trick people into thinking you're conscious, but guess what? You're not conscious. And Eric Wargo, a friend of mine, a contemporary colleague of mine, has argued that what computers really need to manifest is precognition to be conscious, and they're not going to do that either. And that's why AI is not conscious and never will be. So I think you can get this argument from a lot of computer scientists, actually. A lot of people in the field and in the industry who are central to it will tell you the same thing. So again, that history to me is like, it's not just history, it's like philosophically impactful. It tells us something about the phenomena that we otherwise wouldn't know.
Yeah. And I appreciate the idea of AI not being able to be conscious, because it's not going to be able to do telepathy and precognition and these kind of things. I think that's that's insightful. I like that, because I've asked people a few times, like, what are your thoughts on, I've had questions from patrons and stuff. Will AI be conscious eventually, and that kind of thing? And
the answer is no. The answer is no, Ben.
Yeah.
The answer is no. You can relax about that, and that doesn't mean that AI is not useful or we shouldn't do it. Of course, we should. Of course, I mean, AI is in our lives. I mean, I use AI every time I drive to work. It's what creates it. It's what my truck uses to not run into the person in front of me. I mean, I love AI, but do I think it's conscious? No, of course not.
Yeah. That's I think people will see that, I think, in the future when AI becomes able to impersonate a human flawlessly and stuff, and then we're going to realize there's still major gaps missing here. And as you mentioned some of them.
Yeah, let me kind of return to an earlier question of you. So Jacques Vallée again.
Yeah.
What people generally miss about Jacques Vallée is that he did a PhD in computer science in 1969. And guess what his subject was? Artificial intelligence. And guess how he influenced the UFO and the remote viewing world? Through computer science. Guess how he thinks about synchronicity? Through computer science. So it's not that the model or the discipline's not useful. That's not what I'm saying at all. It's that if you really understand and talk to these computer scientists, you recognize that this is not the same thing as consciousness.
Yeah.
And the idea that they're linked is really a kind of science fiction idea or a fantasy. It's not a reality.
Yeah. This question is from Robert in Singapore. Jeff writes about the flip that scientists and engineers undergo when they are forced to accept the reality of non-materialism. I think I experienced the flip without any direct experiences, but just through listening to podcasts like this one. Thank you, Robert. Is there any way to encourage friends, family, and colleagues to flip without appearing as insane, or is it essentially a path that people need to find by themselves?
That's a great question, and I get it all the time. This is going to sound like a nerdy answer. What was his name, by the way?
It's Robert. He's based in Singapore, so I might have said Robert in Singapore, but yeah.
Okay, Robert. This is going to sound really nerdy. So I write a lot about something I call the superhumanities, and by that I mean the humanities, so literature and philosophy, and ethics and the study of religion. You name it. The study of art. That's encoded, though, with altered states. In other words, you don't get the novel until you have these altered states in the writer of the novel, who then writes the novel. And what happens is people pick up that novel and they're like stunned by it, and they don't really know why, but they're stunned by it because of the altered state that's encoded in it. That's what I'm trying to say. And so that's how you flip your family members, is by giving them books and podcasts and television series that are encoded with these altered states. But you can't guarantee the flip, Robert. You can't. The truth is that, as the ancient rabbi said, you have to have ears to hear. And most people don't have ears to hear. It's a kind of a lonely thing to be flipped. I'll give you an example. Here's an example. So an author named Jessica Waite wrote me recently. Jessica just came out with a book a few weeks ago, actually, called A Widow's Guide to Dead or For Dead Bastards, right? And it's this really lovely book, tragic book, profound book, about how her husband Sean died very, very young. He keeled over from a heart attack in a Houston airport. And she goes through all this grief in the book, particularly around discovering his stash of porn, among other things. This is the dead bastard part of the title. But you realize that Sean also was bipolar. And you begin to realize that sexual addiction is actually a symptom of the bipolar condition. And you begin to sympathize with Sean as Jessica goes on in the book. But then what happens about halfway through the book is Sean starts to show up, as parapsychologically, things start to teleport through the room, and she starts to have all these weird encounters with books, and she realizes that Sean is trying to communicate with her, from the other side, as it were. And people won't talk to her about this. She goes to her therapist and she's like, look, this is what happened. And the therapist just treats it as a symptom, as a wish fulfillment. And, Jessica's point is that working through the grief and working through the parapsychological phenomena are all together. Mm-hmm. And you can't pull one out from the other. And the grief somehow allows the teleportation and the library angels and all the stuff that happens. So again, there's trauma there, but that the paranormal phenomena are part of the healing. This is where I'm trying to go with this. And where I'm really trying to go with this is, you would never get Jessica's book without those altered states. It wouldn't happen. You couldn't ever get such a book. Mm-hmm. But Jessica had those altered states, and her husband died, and now you have the book. So, and anybody can pick up that book, anybody can read that book, and some people will be flipped and other people will just think I don't know what they'll think. It doesn't read at all like a fantasy, by the way. It reads like this is what actually happened, because guess what? That's what actually happened.
Yeah.
So that's a long answer to Robert's question. Is I don't think you can automatically or systematically flip loved ones or family members, but you can set things up in a way that encourages that or makes the accident more likely to happen, I guess.
Yeah. I got a part B from Robert as well, totally unrelated or rather unrelated, and I have no idea if you'll have anything to say about it, but is Jeff familiar with the work of Edgar Cayce and the Akashic record? If so, what does he make of it?
Yeah, I am of course familiar with it. I don't know it well. I did work with a channeler for an entire month, Paul Selig, and I know that whole channeling community, and I know the literature fairly well. I think with someone like Edgar Cayce, I'm spitballing it here. I think was entirely genuine, and that he was indeed experiencing all of these things. But again, that's the stained glass that I was referring to earlier. I would be suspicious of the stained glass, but I would not be suspicious of the light shining through it, to sort of put it in a nutshell. And I would say the same thing about Edgar Cayce. I think those altered states are incredibly important and key to the whole shebang, including human history. And I think those teachings that came out of it should be certainly listened to and taken in, but I wouldn't personally sign my name to it.
Yeah. Okay, so my next question is something actually I heard on that UFO podcast, an interview that you did on there. You were asked something about paranormal experiences or something like that, and you said actually loads of paranormal experiences are negative and terrifying. And obviously, I'm familiar with this idea that there are these negative experiences. There's even negative and terrifying NDEs, but can you elaborate on that and maybe share some of the experiences that stuck with you? The way you said it, it seemed like there maybe was something in your mind, some particular experiences that you were thinking of. I don't know.
Well, again, just briefly, I know as a historian of religions that the human experience of the sacred is as terrifying as it is attractive.
Yeah.
So these things do not surprise me. I would expect to find them in the phenomena. I want to recognize, though, that, for example, most of the history of magical practice is about killing prey or other people or seducing someone or doing something that I think most of us would consider negative. I think that's one reason magic as a kind of human power is rejected. I also think it's behind the contemporary fear of psi, by the way. This is Stephen Browdy again. To me, the fear of psi is a really significant phenomenon. We definitely don't want it to be so. And I think one reason we don't want it to be so is we know that it's a human power, and that if it can be used for good, it can probably be used for ill.
Yeah.
So I don't want to dismiss those negative experiences. I want to think with them and think about them. But again, I'm deeply skeptical of the demon or the devil as a go-to explanation. Because a lot of human behavior is really sinister and negative as well.
Yeah. Yeah, if I asked you, are humans evil, then obviously, there are certain aspects of humanity that would seem like they could be evil. So it's never an easy question.
Well, yeah, maybe many aspects. I mean,
yeah, definitely. You wrote Changed in fact, before I ask you about that, about the book Changed in a Flash, you were saying about how we're afraid of science and stuff like that, and it made me think also religions, they kind of have a big issue with a lot of this phenomena, like and in Christianity, to not to pick on Christianity or anything, but they frequently, like in response to phenomena such as mediumship, just like, oh yeah, no, evil, of the devil, not even gonna think about that. And it's maybe a similar reaction for various phenomena, and maybe it's similar from other religions too, but why do you think that is? Why is that? And and how widespread is it?
Yeah, it's very widespread, and it goes back to my notion of the superhuman. I think what is so offensive and problematic about a lot of paranormal phenomena is that they're clearly human, and that they come from the human being who is the source of them. They do not come from God. or outside the natural world. And this is what I meant by the supernatural, 3 words, is that, these powers and these phenomena come from the human or the superhuman. And that's why they're condemned and considered bad or evil in a lot of monotheistic traditions in particular, because they don't come from God, they come from the human being. Mm-hmm. And for something to be supernatural, one word now, it has to come from God, it has to come from outside the natural world. So that's the simple answer to your question. I do think religions as a whole are profoundly contradictory on this one. They're fine with miracles as long as they support their worldview. They're not fine with miracles that don't support their worldview.
Yeah, healing, as long as it's done, as far as they're concerned, by God, is fine.
If it's the Blessed Virgin Mary, great. If it's a UFO, bad.
Or another person, no.
Right.
Yeah, it's fascinating. The supernatural, the 3 words, I like it because I've always thought of all of this phenomena. The way we need to perceive it is natural. It is part of nature. It's just parts of nature that we don't understand yet.
Let me add just a correction to that, or an addition. So you will often hear the phrase "the paranormal is normal," and I always say no, it's not. And what I mean by that is paranormal phenomena want to be noticed. They're eerie and weird and strange by intention. And to the extent you make them normal, they're going to disappear. And so they're not normal. Are they common? Yes, they're very common. Are they normal? No, they're not normal. So
yeah, they both are, and they're not normal.
Right.
At the same time, just like all of this stuff is both possible and impossible at the same time. I think it was Charles Richer that said, "I never said it was possible. I only said it was true."
That's a good quote for the whole thing, really.
Pretty much. I think I have that in the YouTube description of the podcast in general, rather than just one particular episode, because it does kind of sum it up. You wrote Changed in a Flash with Elizabeth Crone. We probably don't have time to dive into it in much detail now, but maybe just briefly you could say a few words about her, about the book, about her experience, and maybe it's a good time about near-death experiences in general. Wherever you want with the few minutes that we have.
Yeah, I mean, so I met Elizabeth, I don't know what year it was, at the Texas Medical Center, and she was talking about this near-death experience. Elizabeth basically was struck by lightning in 1988 in the parking lot of her Jewish synagogue on the yard site or annual celebration of her grandfather's death. And I heard this story, and I said to Elizabeth, I said, "Wow, that's a great story. You should write a book." And to which Elizabeth said, "I don't know how to write a book." And I said to her, "I know how to write a book, but I don't have a great story." And so the two of us got together and we wrote this book together called Changed in a Flash. It came out in 2018 or so. And it's essentially, the first half of it is Elizabeth telling her story, and the second half of it is me trying to make sense of her story.
Like what you did with Whitley.
Exactly. And I was really thinking about the book with Whitley when I wrote the book with Elizabeth. And both of these are examples of what I call thinking with, which I use with a hyphen. I'm not interested in my own thoughts. I'm interested in other people's experiences and what I think is thought embedded in their experiences. And what happened with Elizabeth, which is so relevant here, is she was massively skeptical of all of this until she was struck by lightning and standing outside her body and having this near-death experience. And one of her first realizations after she got over the fact that her new shoes were exploded was, holy crap, I was so wrong about pretty much everything. And, then she becomes massively precognitive, and paranormal stuff just starts happening all over the place after this lightning strike. And so something happened to her in the near-death experience that I think was really significant. And we get into the trauma. There's a lot of sexual trauma in it, by the way. We get into the phone calls from the dead and the precognitive dreams and all kinds of stuff that is really common in the literature, but really obvious in Elizabeth's own case. And she's also very funny, by the way. I've appeared many appearances with Elizabeth in public, and I always feel like the straight guy with a comedian, next to me. Just
Oh, really?
I'm Dick to her Tommy, to use an old Smothers Brothers reference. And but yeah, so she's very funny and eloquent about her own experience, and then I try to come in as the boring academic and say something.
Yeah, awesome. There was a few other questions I wanted to get to. I'm probably going to leave some for a hopeful second interview. One thing I definitely have to ask today is kind of to lead on from where we just finished on that last question. So near-death experiences, lots of people, maybe not so many of my listeners, but lots of people in general would think near-death experiences are the only evidence suggestive of survival of consciousness after death. Obviously, I know, and you know, and lots of my listeners know that there's a lot more to it. So what are your thoughts on the overall body of evidence for the survival of consciousness after death?
Well, again, that's a huge question.
Yeah.
That's a whole nother podcast. But there's a lot, to me, a lot of the
Your
conversation
nutshell
around,
version.
yeah, a lot of the conversation around the afterlife presumes some kind of one life model that's common in the monotheistic West. I was trained in Asian religions. I know most of the world actually works with some kind of reincarnation model. I think it's naive to think that we're just born once. I think it's naive to think we're just this person, we're just this body. I suspect some kind of transmigration or reincarnation model is the correct one. And that the one life, afterlife models of the West are certainly understandable and fit into the worldview, but are not actually the case.
Yeah.
And so when people ask me, basically what I say is I think that the human personality survives for a while,
Okay.
but not permanently,
Not
and that
indefinitely.
it's absorbed into some other greater personality, or it goes on to another life. That's my best guess.
Yeah. And I'm guessing you leave a while pretty ambiguous in the sense anywhere from like 1 or 2 lives to, innumerable.
Well, like, again, go back to Jessica Waite's book. She communicated with Sean for a while, but she actually gives a date when he left. And in Elizabeth's experience, her near-death experience, I often talk about the different symbolic nature of it. It takes place in a garden, and there's a set of mountains with a light behind them, and she knows that if she goes beyond the mountain range, she'll never come back. And so, to me, both of those are symbols or myths about how there's a on this side of the other side, and there's a far side to the other side.
Yeah.
And I think they're quite different.
Yeah. The popular TV show, I think, talked The Good Place. I don't know if you've seen it.
Yeah, I've certainly seen it advertised. I can't watch every show.
Yeah, I'd recommend it if and when you have the right moment in your life, to sit back and just, it's interesting. It has some thought-provoking kind of perspectives and ways of looking at things. But anyway, they have that, I think, in the final episode where it's kind of like they're making this decision to leave this kind of like, not typical afterlife, but something more closely resembling that kind of idea of an afterlife realm, and they're deciding to go into the kind of absorb back into the the essentially the greater consciousness or whatever.
One of the things I say in Change in a Flash is that we die into our imaginations, but that doesn't mean we stay there. That doesn't mean that's the eternal state of consciousness or of our mind.
You said you don't think we would survive, indefinitely, but do you think during that period where we're surviving, we're retaining all of our personality, memories, our sense of self, these kind of things?
I hope not.
You hope we don't retain them?
Yeah, because
interesting. Okay.
I mean, like, take children who remember previous lives. I mean, they have to forget their previous lives so that they can be another person.
Yeah, so they can be involved.
I mean, it's hard enough being one person, Ben.
Yeah.
Much less, 2 or 3 or 800.
Yeah.
I mean, I really hope we don't. Why would we want to keep all of the minor nonsense of a human life? I'm kind of puzzled by that. I don't get that.
Maybe not the minor nonsense, but maybe, like, if I speak for myself, I guess I have probably what's a fairly common like fear of like the idea of, you know, forgetting all of your loved ones and all of your, you know, like important memories and things like that. So like that kind of, I would want to remember some stuff from my current position. I'd say that, but maybe I wouldn't if I see what's behind the veil.
Yeah,
you know? It's hard to...
that's where you get the Western notion of heaven, by the way, right there. Mm-hmm. I'll just say, get over that.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think there's lots of evidence in the you know, the literature that does suggest that memories and stuff are retained to an extent, as you said with the children.
I think they are for a while. I am not at all convinced they're retained, you know, in any kind of atemporal or eternal sense. Mm-hmm. And I don't know why anybody would want that. I mean, look, there have been billions of people on this planet. How many of them do you even care about? A couple dozen, maybe? I mean, what the heck? I mean, you know?
Yeah, but I mean, accumulating memories from multiple lives could be interesting, right? I mean, like, again, if there's certain, like, access specifically in some, you know, going speculative, but some realm.
Yeah, again, this is a long conversation, but this is one of the conversations around reincarnation is what is actually being remembered? Is it just the memories, or is it the actual person that, you know, it's like a balloon is floated from one body to another? Maybe the person's just accessing the memories. Maybe the person is the person who has survived, but the person is not the memories. Mm-hmm. The person is not the body. The person is not the social relations that you're still so attached to. As am I, by the way, Ben. I'm not condemning you. I'm just saying, look, of course we're attached, but, you know, death ends those attachments, you know. Potentially.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't remember the afterlife, and nor am I dead. But so I can't answer the question. But I can definitely talk to people who've had near-death experiences. I can tell you what they say. You know.
Yeah, exactly. And of course there's somewhere a debunker or a skeptic listening saying, see, he doesn't remember the afterlife, so it doesn't exist. But we also don't remember being 2 years old, particularly. So, and I'm pretty sure it's
a silly argument.
I hate that argument. It's the worst. Anyway, like I say, I have loads of other questions. We're going to leave them hopefully for another time, maybe. But I really appreciate the time you've given me today, Jeff. You've been very generous with your time, and I've loved hearing you talk. Is there any, you know, message or any last words you want to leave with people that have watched or listened to this today?
No, I have a new book that just came out called How to Think Impossibly. Yeah. And it sort of returns to a lot of these ideas and themes and tries to do it in a fairly systematic way. So that's the one thing I might suggest is to look at that. But no, and of course I'm happy to come back, Ben. I know it's hard to schedule, but it's good. It's
awesome.
Good.
Well, we'll try and find a date for some time in the future. And for the record, I did have a last question that I was about that book, but I decided to cut it out. It was you've pretty much answered it already in other questions and, you know, bits and bobs here and there. So it's all good.
The short synopsis or elevator speech for that book is how one thinks impossibly is
souls, UFOs, and
one thinks impossibly by not assuming one's worldview. And
Yeah.
I don't care what I don't care what the worldview is. I don't care. Again, I don't care if it's secular science or evangelical Christianity. You have to step out of your worldview to listen to these experiences, and that's thinking impossible.
Yeah, and you said that earlier in the call, and I do think that is really sage, as I said, I think at the time, sage wisdom, sage advice, sage words that people should take on board, and it's easy to get drawn into a worldview, even if it's a new worldview different to one you had a year ago. You might start to then form new things that you expect and things like that. So again, I guess I need to take the lesson just as everybody else does to try and keep it fresh and look at things without an already defined perspective. But again, thank you so much, Jeff. I look forward to doing it again, and I wish you all my very best until then.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you to Jeffrey Kripal for talking with me. Thank you to our amazing patrons for helping us to keep the podcast alive. And thank you for listening. Please see the description for relevant links, including to Jeffrey's books and other interviews you might enjoy. Please subscribe to continue unraveling the universe with us. And if you want to help us keep putting out content, please consider a monthly contribution via Patreon. Thank you.